Hey guys, what's up? This is Alex Duque, and today we're talking about dynamic fluids, um, specifically combustion and fuel and all that stuff. I'm going to start by explaining this with a 2D container because it's a little faster to compute, so it's going to make the tutorial run a little bit faster, but the principles will still apply for a 3D fluid. Eventually we will move into that. So we got this 2D fluid here, and I'm just going to change the size X to 20 and the resolution to 80. So as you know, there's density, velocity, temperature, and fuel. And I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of emitters. That's one emitter. And let's go ahead and add another emitter. And let's go ahead and add another emitter. And I'm going to break the attributes. The reason why I have 3 emitters is because, as you can see, there's density, heat, and fuel, right? Now, each emitter can be emitting all 3, but that's going to complicate life. So I'm actually going to tell the first emitter to emit only density. The second emitter, I'm going to tell it to emit only heat. And the last emitter, I'm going to tell it to emit only fuel. Alright, so the reason why I'm doing that is because right now, if I press play, let's take this to 600. If I press play, you're only seeing the density. You're not seeing the fuel, and you're not seeing the temperature. So I'm gonna actually, so that you don't forget, I'm gonna go ahead and add a annotation to this guy. This guy is a density and this guy is temperature heat, and this guy is fuel. Right, so that's gonna make our life a little bit easier. And let's just scale those locators so that they don't interfere. Ta-da! Okay, so you can see them, I can see them, everybody knows what we're talking about. I'm just gonna add these guys to a layer so that I don't select them accidentally. Okay, so this is the density again. This guy is heat, and this is fuel, like so. And again, if we press play, we're only seeing density. Now, what happens here is that if you look at the, well, first off, we got temperature off and fuel off. So although these guys are emitting temperature and fuel, they're not being computed. Let's take the temperature to dynamic grid and the fuel to dynamic grid. So we're going to press play, and again, we're not seeing them, but maybe we'll get a little glimpse of that right there. So it's taking, but we're not seeing many things crazy going on, right? Well, the reason why is because under the shading, you can actually change the, I'm sorry, not under density, under display. Right now the shaded display is set as render, but I can play it, tell it to view only density, or view only temperature, or view only fuel. So now you can see the behavior of each one of those. Now because they're all in the same container, then you can see that the fuel is being generated and it starts being spilled on there. So if we do density and temperature, you can see the density and a little bit of the temperature going on there. And density and fuel, you can see the density and a little bit of the fuel happening on there, and so on and so forth. But it's important to note that they work individual, and of course then you can mix and match. So I'm just going to get rid of this density value, or this density emitter actually. So we only have temperature and fuel. The reason why is because when it comes to the shading of the fluid, you can tell the incandescence to be based on temperature, and you can tell the color to be based on temperature too, and you can tell the opacity to be based on temperature too. So that allows, if we change this display as render, remember that as render we didn't see the temperature. Well, now we can see the temperature. So there's our temperature. Or we can set it to, to be the fuel. So what happens is combustion happens because of two things: temperature and fuel. If you have temperature and then you have fuel, then the fuel is going to combust thanks to the temperature, right? So you're actually going to see a combustion thanks to the fuel. So let's switch this over to fuel, and this guy over to fuel, and this guy over to fuel. Let's take the color, and I'm going to make the color black, so you can actually see the incandescence happening on there. See, that's our fuel, and it's heading over here. Let's wait for it a little bit, and it starts and goes up into a combustion and then dies out. So that's pretty much the principle going on there. Of course I can always change the, let's say, the incandescence to be based on temperature. So now let's see if we get to see that temperature rise. There we go. That's our combustion happening right there. And of course then eventually you can change the colors. Let's change this transparency to temperature 2. And now we're not going to see anything. Well, we're going to see this temperature happening there. But yeah, so what's happening is that the fuel, once it gets mixed with the heat, it makes combustion and emits light, and therefore makes combustion right there. The rest is playing with the values to get the right attribute going on here, or the right look. But that's the principle. Just to take a look at the properties under the content details. Temperature. The temperature, there's a scale and there's a buoyancy, dissipation, and diffusion. And as far as fuel, there's a reaction scale, a reaction speed, and an ignition temperature. There's a maximum temperature and the heat released. So, and of course the light released. And that's all that final combustion that you see here happening once the fuel mixes in with the temperature. Again, once you get to that point, that incandescence is showing you the reaction of both the temperature and the fuel. And once it combusts, temperature gets released and everything goes back down to black because the combustion already happened. So that's pretty much the principle. Now, I hope you understand that principle. Just go ahead and select this guy and delete it, and select this guy and delete it. I should just make a new scene. So I'm just going to go ahead and fluid effects, and this time we're going to go and do a 3D container. So here's a little 3D container, and I'm going to change some settings here. Just change the size to 20. Let's make it 40. And 10. Let's make this 10. 10. Let's make this 5. So this, let's make it 45. Actually 40. Yeah, 5 and 40 and 10. Let's make it twice. 80, 10, and 20. So we got our voxels there. And one cool thing that you can do with fluids is you can actually paint the values. If I go add edit content, I can actually paint fluids tool. And in here, I can paint fuel. So it's going to ask me to set it to dynamic, and I'm going to say yes. And what you can see here, oops, what you can see here happening is that depending on how I rotate, you can see the axes that you're going to be painting. So I'm going to paint on the Z axis right there. And actually I'm going to switch it over for a second. If you look at this lock, once I lock it, then when I tumble, it's not going to change. So I'm just going to go ahead and look for this one and lock it, and now I'm seeing my Z there. And you can scale this bigger and smaller, and you can change the size of your brush as well if you want to. So I'm just going to go on and paint. And you can paint by just painting, or you can flood it. I'm not going to get crazy here. I'm just going to paint a little straight line of fuel. And unlock that here. And now come into this, unlock it, move it over to that side, and just going to paint in a little bit more fuel here. And now let's unlock it and look for the Z. I'm sorry, for the Y. Come on. There we go. And again, I'm going to lock it, move it down, just going to paint a little bit more on this side. Let's make it a little bit more interesting looking. There we go. So what I just painted in, remember, is fuel. Alright. So back to W, and looks like there's nothing there, but if we change our display to fuel, then there's our fuel. It's painted in, which is kind of cool because, you know, it's painted. It is dynamic, but it's painted in. Now, as we were talking about before, if we wanted to have a combustion, we would need temperature. So I'm going to go ahead and going to add an emitter. And this little volume emitter is right here, is going to emit not density, not fuel, but heat. And it looks like there's nothing happening, but let's go ahead and change the settings of our fluid. So now back to as render, and let's go to content details, and let's see what we have: temperature and density. So temperature and fuel. Our temperature is set to off, so let's make it the dynamic grid. And let's change our display for a second to fuel. See if there's we can see that reaction happening. Look at what's happening to the fuel. It's dissipating as the combustion is happening. So if we just increase those voxels per second, and if we were to change the reaction speed, Now you can really see that fuel being burnt out because of the temperature, and once it gets to the explosion, just so you can see what's happening on there. So we painted in fuel, and we told an emitter to emit only temperature, and now that that reaction is happening, then it starts doing its thing. So now let's go back to display as render, because yeah, this looks nice, but you know, it's not rendering, and we want it to render nice. So for rendering purposes, then we go into our shading. So we're going to change our opacity to temperature. Let's press play. You can see that happening now as it's making that combustion, and it starts dissipating. Now this guy, this emitter, is still emitting temperature, and I don't know if I want that, so I'm just gonna keyframe the heat. Say at frame 20, set key, and the next frame that's no longer existent, set key. So it emits heat for 20 frames and then it stops emitting heat. And the rest is just the heat that's inside of the container now because of that combustion. You know, the heat's getting up to that point of the fuel, so it's happening. And you can see how that's dissipating. Now, back on the emitter, or back on the fluid, I'm sorry. Let's go ahead and change this to, let's see what happens if we make it fuel. And let's make the color black, and let's see what's going on. So you can see that once that fuel is dissipating, because it's now turned into heat, it's over there. Let's try temperature and see what that gives us. So get our temperature, and it's little by little, as it's dissipating, should become more black. If we move this over here and move this over here, make it a little bit more grayish, and we just have a good color scale. Let's make this white, and let's make this more like that, and let's make this more like that. Of course, you can always bias this. Then little by little, let's make the color based on fuel. Let's see if we can enhance it a tad bit. So we're getting that motion happening there, so it's pretty cool. And we can always add maybe a little bit of turbulence. If we go to the temperature, we can increase or decrease the amount of buoyancy for the temperature. So like if I make it -5, now the temperature, instead of going up, is going down. but you know, temperature tends to go up. So we can increase the dissipation, so it dissipates a little bit faster, and we can increase or decrease the scale for how solid that is, and we can give it some turbulence if we want to. And yeah, so anyway, you can see that combustion happening right there. It's just killing out the fuel. So that's a pretty basic explanation of this, guys. Of course, there's always a lot more you can do to all these things. I'm gonna do one more thing here. I'm gonna put a surface in here, alright? And just to explain something else that you can also do is I can select this and that, and then say fluid effects, emit from object. Just reset my settings. I don't want heat, I don't want fuel. This is just gonna emit density. Actually, it's just set to emit heat. So you can see that heat being emitted from this surface. And one cool thing you can do is you can make another surface, and if you tell that surface to be, actually let's just select this. If I go and if I make it collide, it's just gonna kill out the fluid. Let me just show you. I'm just gonna have two versions of this. So I'm gonna do that one and this one, and fluid effects, and make collide. So if I actually make that collide, Shift W and Shift W, then what that's going to do is just going to collide with the fluid. And what it's doing is not actually dissipating the fluid or anything like that, it's just colliding it with it. So it gives you the idea that there's something going on there, but it's actually, all it's doing is just killing the fluid wherever. It's like hiding it, if you want to think of it like that. It's actually not pushing the fluid. And if you actually want to make it push the fluid, then what you need to do is you make a motion field. Make a motion field. So now when this guy goes from here to there, instead of it killing that fluid, what it's going to do is that it's going to push. See the difference? This one's actually pushing the fluid. See how it's dragging it with it because of the speed? So there's a big difference when we make a collide and make a motion field. So you gotta be careful as to what it is that you want to do, because if you want to actually make that real interaction between the surface and the fluid, then you want to make it drive the fluid, and then that's when you make a motion field. Alrighty, so I hope that this tutorial was a little bit helpful, and that you got to understand some of the attributes about fluids and some of the basics of making explosions and little things like that in combustion. So I'll see you next time with the next tutorial. See ya. Bye bye.